Okay, well, our speaker today is Allan Hayes, and Allan was a Church of England choir boy from the ages of 8 to 14, so you can all now try and imagine him looking very angelic and a little rough or something like that.
Informed choice.
Pardon?
An informed choice.
Informed choice, yes, okay. We might get him singing later on. And I'm very interested to actually learn that he claims that he became a humanist at that time. Was it about the age of 14 you became a humanist, Allan?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So the Church of England did a very good job with Allan. Allan read maths at Trinity College, Cambridge, and he taught at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and then Purdue University in Indiana, and then the University of Leicester. And he's had a lifelong interest in religion and humanity, both personally and on various boards. He was on the board of the British Humanist Association, the Sea of Faith Network, All Faiths and None, and Leicester Secular Society. And over the last 12 years or so, he's been concerned with bringing people together. And 4 years ago, he became the oldest person in the world to hold a license from the global organisation TED. I'm sure many of you have seen TED Talks on YouTube. And this keeps him very busy and suits his interests. So I think we're going to have a very interesting afternoon. Allan's going to talk for roughly 30 to 40 minutes first of all, and then we'll open it up into questions when we'll start passing the microphone round so that we can hear your questions. So will you please give a very warm welcome to Allan Hayes.
Thank you very much. Am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. I hadn't realized when I undertook to give this talk that it would be a 4-hour journey by train. And I hadn't realized, having realized that particular thing, that would allow me a lot of time to think. Which means that a few points in the talk that I was going to give will be added to by talks that have occurred on a rail journey. And one of the thoughts that occurred to me coming in to Birmingham and looking at the immense amount of industrial development with warehouses and stockyards and cranes and so on, of the imbalance between the value that we put on material goods and the value that we put on something that is even more remarkable, and that is the ability of human beings to get on with one another and to contribute their own inimitable elements to the development of humanity. It is one of the most amazing achievements of human beings that they can work together while being so, I nearly said bloody-minded, but at least very determined to do their own thing. And of course it does lead to events that we don't want. We would prefer on reflection that we hadn't had. So this combination of cooperation and fighting between us is something that is inherent in human beings. The fighting may just be over an idea, but nevertheless it can boil over into something else. So that thought suddenly occurred to me, and it was a new one to me, to look out and think how wonderful the world is, how wonderful people are, how the soccer crowds, I think, coming out in Southampton were separate people with their own ideas, their own wishes for their team and for other things, and yet somehow or other human beings have achieved this cooperation that enables them to go to the moon, to develop medicine and so on. And this, I hope, eventually we will get to communicating better to our children than merely telling them that they must do this because of a book, however good some of the contents of that book might be. To cherish other human beings, to cherish humanity as a whole, to appreciate what it's taken, partly by chance, partly by biology, but largely for the last 200,000 years through the worked out ideas of people, how they should relate to one another. All right, sometimes how they are going to behave with one another, or else. There are dictators, there have been kings, but in some way we've worked out a way of cooperating so that our contributions gradually accumulate. So that, for example, Arabic astronomers contributed towards Copernicus. He was relying very much on the observations that they had made. And one could go on through that sort of comment. So perhaps I should add a little bit to the sort of activities that I'm involved with, because in a way, though I gather that similar things are happening around here, it is a bit odd to some people that I should be, well, I'll confess, paid to give talks for the Church of England organisation. Sorry, I tend to wander off. Do tell me. And I should also be an accredited speaker for the Humanist Association, the Humanism UK now. But I find it not at all amazing, because I now find that I share interests with people who are in the religions, and I get on with them. And it's not at all hard to do that in Leicester, where we have nearly half the population made up of Muslims, Hindus, and so on, though some of them may be classified as such simply because that's what's expected of them by others. So it's not at all difficult, and I'd like to just go over what I'm doing, because my activity with St. Philip's Ecumenical Centre is fairly regular, and it may, as I said earlier, surprise some people. But what we do is we gather together at some ghastly hour in the morning, sometimes before 7 o'clock, to get into a minibus and to go possibly as far as Boston or beyond, Boston in Lincolnshire. And we then go into a school and we set up our tables. Mine is labelled Humanism, and others are labelled Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. And then children come in and we talk to them. And we get through about 200 children, or practically the full school at times, during this period. And of course, as you would expect, the Muslim tells them about Islam and how good Islam is and why he is a Muslim, and so it goes on. So what on earth do I tell them about? What are we going to say to young children? Are we going to say that we have funerals? Are we going to say we have weddings? Are we going to say we have possibly baby namings and so on? Well, I do remark on that, but it's towards the end. My main interest is stimulating inquiry, stimulating a feeling that the world is wonderful, stimulating a feeling for time. So I'm teaching them to ask how things have come about, and how remarkable it is that human beings have managed to do what they have. Some things can get quite intriguing, but I must confess that one of the main attractions is a woolly diplodocus, a woolly dinosaur. Now, you think, well, what's a woolly dinosaur? Well, of course, it's accompanied by a photograph of the skeleton of a full-size dinosaur. And in fact, I bought it because the director said, you need something for young children to touch. And this is one of the big problems, I think, for humanist speakers, in that whereas the religions have got all sorts of objects, including turbans for the Sikhs and drums for the Sikhs and all this, that and the other, that are tactile. I don't have any tactile display. Well, in fact, I do. And one of them is an ammonite. What does an ammonite do? It says that the world is millions of years old. It's a real thing, millions of years old. And I got it up a mountain in Morocco. And somebody had cut it in half and polished it to show its interior. And then, of course, I say, how did it get up a mountain? And they say, well, maybe it crawled up. Or maybe this, maybe that. But very, very few get the right answer, which is that the ocean was squeezed together by tectonic plates until it squeezed up into a mountain. Now, does that have anything to do with religion? Well, what is religion? What is religion? It's trying to make sense of this life, trying to arrange a story that you feel you must be part of, or that you want to be part of. And I want children to be part of this huge story that we are gradually learning. We only found out about tectonic plates, about 1970 or so. We didn't know how that ammonite got up a mountain until then. And so it goes on. So that's the sort of thing that I ask. But then I say to them, what is the most wonderful thing about being a human being? And some of them will say, it's that we can love one another, which is a very good answer, in fact. But then I say, how do we come about learning to love one another? And that leads to another question. How did we learn to speak? And all coming back to this idea that humanity is quite remarkable, and trying to build up a story. Hiawatha was one of my favourite poems when I was at school. Ye who love a nation's legends, love the ballads of the people that call to us from far off. I'm not getting it quite right, to pause and listen. Legends are important to people. Legends are especially important to young people. And it's my view that we neglect young children, thinking that the stories have all got to be very much Bible stories, that we have stories of our own that we can tell them. So that's the sort of general trend. How do we come to regard one another, to take care of one another? We're not the only animals that do it, but we do it very effectively, like we do most things very effectively. How do we do it? So that brings us to evolution. How has it come about that we've used our brains to do these things? Or that we started doing them in the first place? And that introduces yet another aspect of that. A common challenge from the religious side is that we can't explain the why of things. We can explain the how, the mechanisms, but why? To come back to the point, why do we have regard? Why do we have compassion? But then again, if we look widely, how does a bird care for its young? How does a mammal care for its young? Is it by reading a book? No. It's by a drive that is built into it. And something that's quite remarkable. You may have seen the return of the two young men to the lion that they brought up after 2 years. Not being bowled over by the lion, but being hugged by the lion. I mean, what on earth is going on here? But we don't know how. And we don't know what consciousness is. We know that we are conscious. We feel that we have free will. What it is another matter. But we don't know. There's a very interesting book called Sapiens by Harari. And in the middle of that, there's a little chapter that suddenly struck home to me. The discovery of ignorance. The admission that there are things we do not know. And that plays a very important part in my relationship with religious people in particular, and I'll come to him later, the director of the St. Philip's Centre, that there are things we do not know. We may have a story about them, and to a certain extent you could regard religion as the stories that work, that have got mechanisms built into them that enable us to play in our heads with them and to work out things. A very famous working out, of course, is with Hawkins, who has just died, Stephen Hawkins. But this picture of human beings as not knowing something, but being inquisitive and cooperating on finding at least possible explanations, possible stories, games, models, if you like, of what it is, using special languages like mathematics, which is itself a remarkable creation of the last 1500 years or so in its present form. In fact, much later than that in its present form. So to admit that there's a lot that we don't know, and that if we want to know them, we're going to have to work together to solve these problems. And to come back to the comparison on the way in to Birmingham, that the work must be not just on the physical side, but also on the psychological side, on the sociological side. We have got to know ourselves better than we do and act on that knowledge with a cherishing of other human beings and for humanity, excuse me, as a whole. Now, that is what I think we are not doing with religious education at the moment. Just think of what happens in most religious education. You get taught about religions. You get taught about religion. Religious literature is supposed to be the aim of the revision that's going on at the moment. But what are the facts? Are young people going to be receptive to something that's based on religion, especially in the way that it's formed? Excuse me, this seems to have turned itself off, and no, there we are. And quite often figures like the ones I'm going to produce here are regarded as being attacks on religion. They are not attacks on religion. They are simply statements of fact. This is the background against which you're going to have to teach young children how to behave in a society as complex and as capable of evil and damage as ours is, and also as capable of good and compassion as ours is. The latest figures, actually produced by a professor at a Catholic university, so give the Catholics the credit for working on these things in a reasonably academic way. 70% of, well, these are 16 to 29-year-olds, 70% have no religion. 70% have no religion. 59% have never been to a religious service. Over half, well over half. 7% are Anglican, 10% are Catholic, 6% are Muslim. And from 18 to 24-year-olds, looking at a different aspect, 41% of those questioned thought that religion was a force for evil. 14% thought it was a force for good. 25% believe in God. 19% in some spiritual power. Maybe I believe in a spiritual power, but I don't know what it is and whether it should be called spiritual. 38% just don't know either way. And in fact, a further 18% specifically say they don't know. And Linda Woodhead, about a year ago, gave a long talk on religious leaders don't represent religious people. And that has been exacerbated by the recent investigation by the committee looking into sexual abuse. Now, I'm not using this to attack the church. I'm just looking at what the background is that we're dealing with, that we have to deal with, that it is there. 3 weeks of investigation of the Church of England in which the present Archbishop was questioned by a Commons committee, and the previous Archbishop, Rowan Williams, was also questioned, and the present Archbishop, I think it was that one, yes it was, said he was ashamed of the church. Now, what's the significance of that? Not something to beat the church with, because there are other institutions, non-religious institutions, perhaps with not the same opportunities and so on, and the same good behavior expected of them, but there are. But sexual abuse is well distributed in the family as much as anything, for example. So it's something to be tackled. But from the point of view of government, the significance is, as one of the lawyers said, the Church of England cannot be allowed to mark its own homework. It has to be part of humanity and judged by the standards of human rights. I tend to ramble on, but you get the idea that we are dealing with a big thing. Now, let's just come back to evolution. What that provides is a story, and not just a story of biological evolution, but a story of sociological and instinctive evolution. How does a single-cell animal gradually accumulate other cells? how does it begin to be able to make a model of the outside world in its own head that it can play with, that it can then pass on by language to another one, and so on. These are quite remarkable things. But going further down the line, is it right that evolution is just survival of the fittest? Well, of course it is, but what do we mean by fittest? Is it fighting it out with the toughest? When Jane Goodall, with her group of chimpanzees, who she thought were peaceful, became so big that they split, one of them wiped out the other, literally wiped them out. So there are problems. But nevertheless, you can get the evolution of good. Why? Because it makes you better at surviving, and if necessary, better at fighting the other lot. So to be compassionate and care for your own internally may not necessarily reflect on the wider environment, but it's something that human beings have got to face up to now, because we don't have tribes that can survive if some don't succeed. We are now at a position where we could, in fact, wipe out practically the whole of humanity. So, ethical questions, questions of relationships, of cherishing one another, become crucially practical questions. So we can get the evolution of care within the group. It's called group selection. It was argued over a great deal in the last few years, last 20 years or so. So what are we going to do? In discussion with Tom Wilson, who is the director of St. Philip's, and together with Riaz Ravat, who incidentally, at least I think so, is a Muslim. It just goes to show, doesn't it? I would have to say that I've never explicitly had it stated, but there we are. This is what can happen certainly in Leicester. I've written this book, Learning How to Live Well Together. What we've come to the conclusion, especially within, well, it's so practical within Leicester that we have so many different religions now, including the only Jain temple in the UK, that we have no option really but to live together. And I digress a little in saying that we are very fortunate insofar as most of the Muslims and Hindus came out of Uganda and East Africa. And why did they come out? Because they were competent businessmen. And the competition with the native blacks was not very welcome, so they were driven out. So of course we get them in Leicester, having told them not to come because we were full up. And we had an advert in East African newspapers. And they promptly start making their way in business, and not just business, but politics. So we have quite a collection of councillors now. And so it goes on. We've got the makings for a wonderful combination of people in Leicester. So we agree, the sort of model that we've got in mind is that the really crucial thing is the common purpose of living well together. Now, you can develop that like you can most expressions, but we've got a pretty good idea of when we're going to have a happy city, when we're going to have a successful city, when we're going to live well together. And that is the aim. That is the aim, that each part contributes to the whole, not a homogeneous group of people. Do you want a homogeneous group of people? You want people with different ideas. All right, there are difficulties when those ideas are ideas that can be misused. But that's it. Living well together is the crucial thing, and the steps are gradually to build up sufficient trust and acceptance that people live by, if you like, stories. We all live by stories. What's been the British Empire? I was brought up on William Wallace, of all things, and Robert the Bruce, simply because they were exciting people. We all live by stories, but some stories are better than others, and some are well-founded. The scientific stories are well-founded. And the other thing is, how do we stop people feeling that their story is so precious that they must protect it against all influences, that they must attack those who are not the same as themselves, because that is what gives them their feeling for being a good human being. And if the others don't have it, then they can't be a good human being. This is a terrible use of stories, but it's something that needs to be tackled. And we come back to Harari's book and the little chapter, The Discovery of Ignorance, that it may only be a story, but it's your story. And are you going to make good use of it, or are you going to make use of it that is not good? And that brings me back to I think it's the footnote to the establishment of the Commission on Religious Education. The interim report came out a few months ago. And I say that because I've just been jolted into it by playing around with my mobile phone on the way down here, when I found that my sharing, my passing on of this had been passed on further. And so it came to my attention again that religion is a good thing except when it's misused. And I changed it to humanity is a good thing except when it's misused, and developed this idea that we want to have a broadening of religious education so that it becomes education in humanity. In time, 300,000 years, and in present behavior, and more and more and more in the future, because we are now in a position to determine how humanity will develop, indeed whether it will be able to develop and continue at all. We are now in a position to make these decisions. All the stuff about artificial intelligence, about robots and all that sort of thing. How do you inject these mysterious feelings into computers? Asimov's law of robotics, that a robot may not allow a human being to come to harm, and all these sort of things are being swept aside. What we're wanting to do is to inject, well, it's not the right word, but to put into our robots modes of behavior that almost amount to feelings. So it's very important now that we face up to the fact that we have to understand ourselves better. and we have to act on that understanding. So there we are. Agree that we want to live well together. Bring in other people. Accept that we live largely by feelings and largely by stories. And just as an aside, I like making asides, but when I joined the Sea of Faith, which is a group of people who are still actively within the church, but not believing in the church, I found that they were saying that stories are the crucial thing. That is what binds people together. And to fly off even further as an aside, I remember an account from an Indian being asked by an American soldier, "What stories do you tell your children when you sit around your campfire?" Because that's what makes them part of your tribe, the stories that they imbibe. And we need stories to tell our children that make them regard behaving well to human beings and to humanity, to cherish humanity and to cherish other human beings actively, not just as a theory. So that's the sort of development that I find myself involved in. The commission was set up probably about 2 years ago now. Commission on how to reform religious education. There is an insistence from the religious side that the word religious be kept in it. I have written to them at length saying that I think we ought to have something called education in humanity. They rather jib at humanity as being related to humanism, which is interesting. So I doubt whether we're going to get that. But we are up against, I mean people who would like to see some change in that direction, and there are quite a lot. And I might say that there are quite a few in the church and in the various religions who would dearly like to see some movement in that direction, including a very notable sheikh that I'm friendly with. And indications of that, apart from specific, people beginning to say, first I'm a human being, then I'm whatever it may be, a Christian, a Muslim, or what have you. There's a glimmering of this feeling that there is a responsibility outside your religion, that your religion can only be defended on humanitarian grounds, not on existential grounds, not saying there is a God and that's that, but saying it's good for you. Unfortunately, there's an element of truth in that, because people tend to do what they're told by some greater power or some notable figure. So there's a lot going on, but I'm quite hopeful. And although it may seem to be a rather oblique way of doing things, to concentrate on talking to as many school kids as I can, and others as well, occasionally some older people, I think that the development of a consciousness of what it is to be a human being, a perception of what it is to be a human being, especially in children, in young children, is a very important step towards achieving a better world. Politics, of course, is always going to be difficult. politics and professionalism, singularly enough, but professionalism comes in silos. And so if I'm writing to teachers' organizations, I immediately have the problem that, oh, but we'd have to learn more science. We'd have to learn more of this and more of that. We're already overloaded. And in any case, that's what we undertook, that's what we trained for, to teach not humanity, but to teach religion. We are a religious education teacher. Now we can argue about what religion is, but we are a religious education teacher. So we cannot, the idea of changing this wonderful object, religious education, and making it something different, when what they want to do is to do it better, to do the teaching better, is perfectly understandable. So we have these problems. So again, I come back to, we need to make friends. We need to get appreciation of what it is that we are after, that it is a common good that we're after. In a way, the National Secular Society has got something that the Humanists do not have. Now, I'm not saying the Humanists shouldn't, but I'm just saying that they are different. For example, the recent award, well, it went to two people, of Secularist of the Year, was to a vicar in Lancashire, an Anglican vicar. And why was it given to him? Because he had fought his church, he had criticized his church heavily because of sexual abuse. And of course, as I said earlier, this has become a major issue, not just for the church, but he got that award because he had stood out. And he's not the only one. Some of the most moving letters about sexual abuse within the church that have appeared on Facebook have been from vicars who are distraught at the idea that their church is able to behave in this way, or has behaved in this way. So I do recommend, and I believe that you are busy doing this, finding a common ground, finding a common purpose that you may approach from different directions and that you may disagree with in many ways. Apparently Welby says that homosexuality is still a sin in his eyes. Okay, but what are they going to do about it? So there we are. I'm fully in support of trying to avoid faith schools. I think there's no point in dividing up children at that level of development or in that way. I used to go to Sunday school. I don't see why you can't have Sunday schools, but to have faith schools I think is not right. But it's rather intriguing that the Church of England is now moving towards trying to assert that it is not a faith school. It is a church school. Now, subtle difference, we shall see. And asserting that it doesn't select, but some do. And of course that's partly one of the glories of the Church of England, that the Archbishop can't tell the bishops what to do. So if a bishop wants to have selection, he can tell his schools, you're going to have selection. They may object as well, but there we go, it's complicated. But I think there is hope. And if you read the book, you can get it on Kindle as well, Learning How to Live Well Together by Riaz, Ravat and Tom Wilson, then you will find quite a move. And lo and behold, what is happening? I've been asked in 10 days' time to take a full morning in the school, doing assembly, doing 3 workshops on values by myself for the St. Philip's Ecumenical Centre. This is, of course, after about 3 years or more going around with the group, but I do feel it's quite a responsibility, and I think it's because we have more or less agreed on a way of working and living well together. At least I hope so. There are some amusing situations, like speaking to sixth form Catholics about sex, and I said to them, well, you know, I've had 80 years of enjoyment of sex and it's great, but you've got to do it in a reasonable way. And one young boy came round afterwards and did a thumbs up sign and said, thank you very much for that. So the well of common sense and understanding amongst young people is to be made, well, not made use of, that's not the right way, but to be appreciated. And a young boy from a primary school who, on going out, gave me a thumbs up sign also. And you know, young children are inquisitive. They enjoy challenges. I know, because I was one once, and so were you. And we've got to keep that flame of interest and readiness to be awkward and carrying over into adolescence, because adolescents are notoriously awkward, and there seems to be good reason for it. We've got to be open and also willing to like people, including, well, all right, I'm rambling on, but I get on quite well with a Catholic priest, for example, locally. But we're all bound by these structures, and it's a real battle to get changes across structures where many people are dependent on their status and on their influence by their position within these structures. So that I know people who say to me, I fully agree with you, but it's further than I can go without losing the support of my own members. And these sort of problems, they're political problems, these sort of problems we've got to face up to, but not by rejecting, but by welcoming and taking as much as we can. So, finally, I decided 4 years ago that I was going to do something that was a bit broader, but is related, and that's I wrote to TED, Technical Entertainment and Design it stands for, but that's out of date now, which is a huge organization. Just look up TED on your computer and you'll find it in its full glory. And we've put on several meetings, the main aim being to get people to express their ideas very clearly and straightforwardly to the audience, and we video them, and they're vetted by the Central Organization for Quality, and then they go out on, anyhow, so that's what occupies me, and I'm hoping, and we had 600 people in Curve Theatre from a variety of backgrounds, and I'm hoping to swing. I'm not fully in charge, there are other people with interests, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to swing something on the 3rd of November, which will be based on the book, the idea that learning to live well together is crucial. And I should say that it's a phrase that can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. How do men live with women, for example? How do we live with children in a responsible way? So living well together might just provide a basis for a full day that in some way or other relates to this. And that's what I'm hoping to produce then. So everything is opening out, and in some rather startling ways. I just learned 3 days ago that TED, in all its wisdom, has decided, as it obviously decided long ago, that the only way to do something is to do it in a big way these days, that you're going to be swamped by some other movement. And so what has it done? For the last 3 years, it's had together some very wealthy people indeed, and said to them, you know, this is our idea, would you let us have some money? What else? And would you help us set up a committee that will be able to disperse, to give out this money? And so they've come up with a setup called Audacious. What else? Audacious. And it's got $250 million at its disposal. And presumably, if it succeeds, it will continue to draw in funds of that order. It's quite mind-boggling, to use a very simple phrase. But that's it. And to look ahead a little bit further about what's going on, and perhaps not so far, the way that capital is being concentrated, this may be one of the significant ways in which changes are produced. Out of the control of governments, but by people who control immense amounts of capital. But that's another story. I think that if we're going to win a political argument about this little matter of religious education, then we need friends, and we need friends in the religions and in the teaching profession. We need to assure them that they will be a valued element in teaching, perhaps far more valuable than they are now. It will be a common purpose in teaching. So, thank you very much. It's been a delight talking to you and being induced to travel for 4 hours and think a bit more and change things. And more than that, it's wonderful to feel that things are moving, and I think they genuinely are moving. The British Humanist, Humanist UK and the secular societies are becoming increasingly effective. Maybe that's the right word. Effective, of course. I'm very impressed by what's happening in the central organisations. And what I'm very keen on is getting it at a local level, both in Leicester, besides the 600 people, and also around the country. So, roll on humanity. Yeah, thank you.
I wonder if I could have a volunteer for the roving mic. Or Dave, are you going to do it, or have you got? Phil? Okay, lovely. Okay, so normal rules apply. You can only speak if you've got the microphone, and when you get the microphone, just hold it nicely to your mouth like that. Don't wave at it, because then we won't hear you. Thank you very much, Alan, for a very stimulating talk. So do we have some questions for Alan. Yes, okay, we've got Aaron straight away. Is it working? Should be okay, yeah.
Thank you for that talk. I was just interested in what you're saying about robots, and if you were to play the role as a Catholic, for example, can you think of a good, valid reason of why you would program a robot with religion? So imagine you've got a robot that's modern technology, walking, talking, it's got all the ethics, it's got all the knowledge. Why would you install religion into that robot?
What's religion?
Okay, a faith in a supernatural being that created the world and all that kind of...
I can think of what presumably you would build a recognition that it was doing something that it shouldn't do. Now, the interesting thing about human beings is that we don't know why we feel we shouldn't do things or why we should do things. What we do initially is feel an urge to do them. Now, that wouldn't be religion. I mean, that's why my initial question was, what's religion? But if you're going to say that, well, for example, Asimov's laws of robotics, I think one of them probably would. Well, I don't know. No, there's no reason to build in religion as such, like God will tell me, except that you are responsible to this system, and if this system is empowered to force you to do something. If that is a religion, okay, but it's an interesting interpretation of religion. And of course, it's one of the functions of God to force you to do things.
My follow-up to that would be, if you aren't going to program a robot with religion, why would you do it to a child?
Why would you do it for?
To a child.
Because religion is one of the stories that children get told, and they get told lots of stories. The trouble arises when they're not allowed to have a full education that says there are other stories. You will hear the story of the religious story, so tell it this is a story that's around. But don't tell it it's got to believe it. So I think this was the insight I got about 10 years ago when I joined the Sea of Faith, that stories are important, and stories are important. And that's why I want to get to young children and get them a feel of what it is for humanity in the large, as it were, in the extended. That I want a story around the campfire for them. In fact, that sounds as though it's a story itself, but in fact, one of the books I was reading recently said that the discovery of fire and the creation of the campfire could well have been one of the crucial steps of humanity, because it brought people together. And they sat under the dark sky, safe from rampant beasts and so on. And what could they do except tell stories or argue with one another and come to some conclusion? So there's a lot to go on here.
Alan, can I just follow up on that question? Because you were saying in your talk about, and you've just reiterated that, about the importance of telling children stories. But I can imagine there's going to be resistance in religious groups to that idea, because they're going to say, well, it's not, they might think that you're implying that, well, it's just a story, and they're going to say, well, no, it actually happened. But I was thinking you also get a lot of resistance from humanists as well, because it almost sounded as though you were suggesting that science is our alternative story. You could call it a story, but there's also a danger of people thinking, oh, well, is it just another... It's almost like postmodernism saying, oh, well, it's just another narrative. It's not actually true. So you're going to get resistance from both sides going down that.
Oh, you will, undoubtedly. In fact, I got total disbelief when I made that presentation to the committee and said that science is stories that work. They have the mechanisms that work. Just as we have ordinary language that enables us to work our relationships with one another and to talk about agreements, so a lot of science is taking place in the language of mathematics that provides a working system that you can set up a meccano, if you like, in your mind that actually does work when you compare it with the outside. How the brain constructs the outside from what it's getting is utterly remarkable. But it is a construction. You have no guarantee whatsoever that it is the same as the outside, but it works well enough for us to move our arms around and to think things and to produce science and to work out how the universe has operated. So there are stories, but some stories work and are very precise. Okay, so it's a very interesting area to start thinking about that. The other interesting thing on a philosophical level is a philosophy called the philosophy of as if, by a German Weihinger about the turn of the last century, that we are always working on the assumption that things will happen as if we forced it or we understood it. When I was doing maths at Cambridge, I challenged Fred Hoyle, famous astronomer at the time. You're telling us about the mechanics of little billiard balls banging into one another and so on, but we know that most of the interactions are electromagnetic. So what's going on here? Well, he said, we're not teaching you just about physics and models that work. What we're teaching you is how to do mathematics. And it may be a different model that you use the mathematics on later. And of course, I now know that there are far more subtle mathematics developed in understanding how the universe may possibly have originated. So we're always working on an as-if basis, producing a new model that does better than the last one. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Simon.
I found it a very interesting talk, and you have an interesting way of going on, that you obviously have a mathematical background, but you're talking in quite a meditative, almost religious way. I like the idea that religions all amount to stories. You know, you might say perhaps rather like the parables that Jesus was telling, or some of the amazing stories in the Old Testament. If humanism was going to be up there with these other religions, developing its own stories, I wonder how that might work, whether perhaps it would, as it were, have a pantheon of people that children would be taught about from all sorts of different religions and races and cultures, but people who had done this thing of bringing people together and achieving human progress and cooperation in not totally terrifyingly violent ways. What kind of stories would be the humanist story?
The humanist stories would include the religious stories in terms of the moral teachings. But the moral teachings will be there with a different explanation. Group evolution, or simply saying we don't know. I don't know why a mother bird feeds its young. I don't know why chimpanzees like being stroked or groomed. Human beings like a lot of these things as well. But there are things that we don't understand. But to say that we are commanded to do them by something out there, or it's put into us, is not, to my mind, a good explanation of it. And it leads to the possibility that some people would say that they are in direct communication with that something, and therefore they are in a superior position to me. There are all sorts of problems. The question is, what works to keep humanity going at the rock bottom? We've survived quite a lot, and we need to survive on, and we need to get into the habit of admitting that we don't know a lot, but we value one another, and we're going to work on doing better. So, yeah,
Alan, can I just add something to that? Because this is something that we've been trying to address when we go into schools. It's very clear that when we go into schools or when we talk to religious education teachers, that they have very nice little booklets about the story of Jesus and the story of Muhammad and so on. And that's how children are introduced to religion, is by stories of these founding figures. And what I've done sometimes is just tell the story of Charles Darwin. Now I know I have to make clear to children that we don't worship Charles Darwin, or we don't think he's God or a deity or anything like that. But it's such a fantastic story, and because Darwin Day is our sort of annual festival, it's clearly if we talk about a pantheon, you could say, well, Charles Darwin is definitely going to be there. And it's just a fantastic story of his life and his voyage on the Beagle and his discovery and how it changed the way we understand where we came from. So it's a fantastic alternative story. So that's one of the stories we actually tell children in schools.
You can tell the story without saying it's supernatural in origin. I mean, there are quite a few people who regard, for example, Jesus as an ethical teacher, but don't think that he's the Son of God. In fact, lots within the churches are of that view now. Whether they admit that it's God is there or not is another matter, but the idea that Christ is there. And of course, Muslims regard Christ as an ethical teacher, but not there. And Muhammad, for that matter. There are all sorts of layers in there, but I think to some extent you can separate out the jump to "and so it is God," or "so he is related to God," or "is handing on God." In fact, that's quite an interesting way of approaching it, because it gives you a grounding in them and an ability to use them and an ability to argue about them without being committed or feeling that you are therefore involved in the religion.
Okay, yes, gentlemen, sorry, I don't know your name. David.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your talk. I was very interested in the idea of a humanities curriculum, about the development of humanity. Anyway, I've recently read a book called "The Better Angels of Our Nature" by Steven Pinker, which charts the apparent decline in interhuman violence over the last 1,000 years.
Oh yes.
And what's caused this. And it drove me to think that our curriculum ought to, particularly perhaps our history curriculum, ought to put an emphasis more on the developments in human nature, driven by things like the rise of literacy and the rise of scientific thought, following Bacon's ideas about developing scientific thought, and how these have contributed to the improvement in the human state. And that sort of thing could perhaps form part of the curriculum that you're suggesting.
I think so. That's one element in my advocacy of That's one element in my advocacy of admitting ignorance and necessity of cooperating to deal with that. You may not, that's a feeling that we jump too easily, or at least historically human beings have tended to jump to a supernatural explanation of things from way, way, way back. And of course it was useful for any monarch to be approved of by God, etc. Lots of things. I'm afraid, have I missed out something from what you said? I wasn't hearing it too clearly.
No, I think that it was the idea that I think there are, certainly there is research now which is pointing to the ways in which, or the features that have driven human development, and if you like, the improvement in human moral ability and our ability to live together. There are things out there which could become part of the story, but they're certainly not part of the school curriculum at this moment in time.
That's right. I think what I would be wary of in that is that unfortunately the damage that we can do has increased in the same way as the good that we can do. And it's far more imminent damage that we can do, perhaps to the whole world and the whole life. So we've got to mature rather rapidly.
Phil, can you come round to Kathy next, and then Mary, but Kathy I think was first. Alright, sorry Kathy, go on. Alright. Yeah, Kathy, put your hand up.
Mine's probably more of a comment than anything else. I go into school, go into schools and talk to young children. Have been a teacher for years. And what I find is difficult when thinking about it is how to go in, present humanism in a very positive view. It's not we don't have a God, we don't have rules, we don't have a book. We do have humanity, and we are wonderful. I mean, humanity has possibilities of being wonderful. And I'm going to a school a week on Monday that David and I went to last year. And on their, I just looked up directions to the school. And on their website, they have actually got a poster for us going in on the week on Monday. And on the walls in their classrooms are pictures of all the questions the children have been asked to think of prior to me going in. And I just think that's really, really positive. And I just thought it backs up what you were saying. The children are inquisitive. They write fantastically intelligent questions that Sue and I are going to have to think of the answers to. When I'm going to go, I'm actually, I don't know if this is the approach you take, we're actually trying to help them think of the answers themselves. And I think I would just like interested in your approach in school.
Could you just repeat, because I wasn't getting that too clearly?
Sorry.
Yes. Well, Kathy was saying that the school that she's going to visit in a couple of weeks' time, the children have already been encouraged to post up some questions around the classroom for a humanist going in. Right. And Kathy is going to be encouraging the children really to try and answer those questions for themselves. And I think Kathy just was interested to know what your response to that approach might be.
How old are the children?
I think they're year 5, so they're going to be 9, 10-ish.
Sorry, what?
About 9 or 10.
9 or 10. It depends how they've been educated. I get children just confronting me and saying, "So you don't believe in God and you don't believe in life after death, do you?" Quite openly, they're already onto that. What would I encourage you to get them to ask? Do humanists love their neighbour?
Is this on? Is this on?
If you hold it like that, it's a bit better.
Yeah, one of the questions on the wall was, how did humanists know right from wrong? I think one was trying to say it was actually not really asking for it was just agreeing with your approach when you went into school. It's very similar.
You could do it by putting up a series of questions, including the golden rule or whatever, and seeing which they think would be things that are beliefs or actions that humanists would take part in. I must say that I think one of the problems that humanism and secularism has is that we are not so evident on the ground as religious groups who are going out, for example, the Church of England going out, all right, it sounds a bit odd, slippers and so on to young women who've lost their shoes when drunk, but more importantly, providing shelters for people, certainly in Leicester, and I think across the country. There's a general problem in visibility of the good that we do at a personal level. We've done a hell of a lot of good at a governmental, a political level. I mean, if you look back to the Deering report, what, about 10 years ago, on the way ahead for the church, it was gung-ho that it was going to get young kids into school and it's going to make Christians of them. If you go back to 1830 or so, you will find that the church is trying to insist that every teacher be a church man. I'm not quite sure what that means. And that everybody go to church on Sundays. It was that level of imposition of one faith that the church was after. It was said that there was no greater impediment to the development of state schools than the Church of England's opposition in all ways, even amounting to stopping them being made cheap enough for ordinary people to send children to. There was an enormous resistance. In Dorset, I think it's in Dorset, of the 1832 extension of the vote, there were 1 or 2 vicars who supported it only. The political problem is still there, but it's getting weaker and weaker, more and more soluble. But I think the only way out is to have something better than just keep on criticizing what's bad. Sorry. I'm slipping away from your question, but I don't really have the answer. I know what I say when I'm faced with children, and I know the questions that they ask me, which are just about everything under the sun. And I know that they are interested in these things. Thank you. Good luck.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
I think with regards to children and young people, it's about continuing dialogue and conversation.
Yes.
My daughter was brought up an atheist, as we were, but we lived across the road from a church, and her friend went to Sunday school, and she wanted to go too.
Yeah.
So we said, yeah, that's fine. It was part of her life education. But every week, we would discuss what the sermon was. We would ask and say, well, what did the vicar talk about today? And then we'd talk about it. And I'd say to my daughter, well, what did you think about that? And sometimes she thought it was okay, and sometimes she thought that it wasn't. And this went on for some years. And I think it's actually about nurturing young people to have self-esteem and confidence that they can actually think for themselves, believe in themselves, and actually make their own rules about their life. I did explain that religion was actually a different faith set of rules for living, and that she actually had to develop her own rules and to live by them and to believe in herself. And I think that's what young people need. They need to be made to feel that they are important, that they're to nurture their confidence and self-esteem. And I think the world would be a better place.
I think that's excellent. When I was, I've become a little bit milder in old age. I was chaplain to the Lord Mayor some years ago. The Lord Mayor happened to be a humanist as well. And we had this civic service in the cathedral. And the Lord Mayor said, I'd like my chaplain to give an address in the cathedral. And the bishop said, only if he sends me his text beforehand. And I said, no, I'm not willing to send you my text beforehand. So the Lord Mayor and I didn't go to the civic service, which caused a bit of a fuss for a short time. But I've since got to know the bishop, and he's admitted that it wasn't the right thing to do, and to some extent I've admitted that what I did was not quite the right thing to do. I could have entered into a dialogue with the bishop beforehand and perhaps won the argument. But of course the formalities of these things don't always allow such niceties. I think conversation, well, what I was going to say, I concocted some precepts, and the first precept was always approach other people with goodwill, expecting goodwill. That's an individual requirement. The group requirement is to organize their society so that this actually works.
I think respect is also a very good word.
So, I mean, that your children feel that it's natural for them to be able to raise whatever question they wish, and they will be welcomed as a contribution to the discussion rather than a challenge. Yeah, I think is important.
Okay, I think we've only got time for one more, so if you come to Dave, Phil.
You were talking about, in your statistics, somewhere in the beginning of the talk, you were mentioning, I think, something like 19% of people thought there was another power, another force, something like that.
Yeah.
And you said, I think I might agree with that. So I was rather intrigued, coming from a humanist, whether you were confessing to something.
I can appreciate your remark. In fact, I welcome it. But it's related to the fact that I just don't know. So if you want, you can make up a story about it, but it doesn't carry any weight with me because I don't know, and I'm jolly sure you don't know. But you may think you know, and there's the problem, that if you think less of me because you think you know and I don't, and that makes me bad, I've had it. No, I really do not know. Perhaps I should have chosen other words, but it's a good idea to raise the questions.
Yeah, I think it was in relation to the fact that you were talking about ignorance, saying that there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah. But people don't like the word ignorance, of course. Let's just say we don't know. It's interesting. It's absolutely fascinating.
Okay, I'm going to allow one more, David Red. So, Phil, if you can bring the...
It's not actually a question, but you just reminded me when you were talking both about the statistics about younger people and lack of belief, and also when you were giving a couple of talks in schools and the kids going out sort of put their thumbs up at you. Back in 2011, when we helped with the, just before the 2011 census, and it was important to get people to tick the box about sort of if they had no religion, because it had been rather distorted in the previous census. So we had a big stand in the centre of Bournemouth, which had the big humanist banner on it, sort of saying, if you're not religious, for God's sake, say so, in the upcoming census. Which was interesting. But the most interest we got, and from the young children and the young kids that came by and came up and engaged with us, I mean, they're not filling in the census return, obviously, but I just thought the future is good, because so many of the children came up and said, yeah, that's right, yes, we don't think there's a God, and that's what we would say. So it was very heartening for the future.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Delightful. Yes.
Okay, well, I'm just wondering, is this working nowadays, this particular mic?
Yes, I'm getting a signal from you, but no sound.
No sound, okay. I think somebody's pointing at it. So let's take the other one. Thanks. Alan, you've given us so much food for thought today. It's going to take me a little while to just chew over, I think, in my mind, many of the things that you've said, and particularly in relation to religious education. And we've got a schools team down here, and also we do, as I said earlier, we do have a dialogue group with Christians locally. So we're doing, quite a few of the things that you're suggesting, but you've given us a lot of food for thought as to other ways we might think about it and approach it. So thank you very much again for your talk, and would you please give Alan a big round of applause.